Hey everyone, Calypso here. Before this preview of the Long Moonlight paints you a word picture, all the links for everything are going to be down below. Purchasing the full audiobook and its sequel from Arcaven Publishing will get you digital versions as well, read through an EPUB reader or a Mubi reader, whatever those are. I think one of them's Kindle, I think. You can also order physical, paperback, or hardcover editions as well, and naturally you can also order these from Amazon, both physical, paperback, and hardcover. No digital or audiobooks or anything like that. You have to go to Arcaven Publishing for that. I've been replaying Thief, and these are the closest things we will get to Thief-like novels that are actually written well, so why not let the rest of the world know about some pretty damn solid pulp books. This is the first chapter only, meant to be a preview of sorts of The Long Moonlight. I'm not making any money from this because, duh, I didn't write or work on this project whatsoever. Once again, links for everything are provided down below for physical, digital, as well as the audiobooks. So enough blabbing, enjoy this extended preview of The Long Moonlight by RazorFist.
Nightvale, Book 1, The Long Moonlight by RazorFist. Read by the author. Chapter 1, Arson and Avarice. Thursday, 23rd of Antirian, 1856. The final tumbler fell into place with a dull click. Xerdes chanced a final glance from beneath his drawn hood to ensure his choice of vocation hadn't been elevated to a spectator sport. Only the looming obsidian spires of the Menuvian skyline glowered back at him. Distant torchlights and illuminated windows lay couched on the dark horizon, benign and sightless. Silence, or as close an imitation as Menuvia could muster. At last, he heaved aside the obese oaken door, the practiced movements of a seasoned sneak ensuring he did so without a sound. The footfalls that suddenly sounded from the end of the street did not cooperate. It was a rattling, heavy-hoofed staccato, the kind only the clumsiest sentry can manage. A long shadow stretched through the lamplight at the end of the street. The thief's wraith-like frame melted through the passageway and into the tavern, and remained there, frozen in space, for several breathless moments. The footsteps outside grew in volume, the sentry's torchlight casting unearthly shadows that crawled across the inn's wood-paneled walls. The footsteps faded. The building stilled. All was pitch inside the inn, not even a pale shaft of moonlight to pierce the velvet shroud. Xerdes went to work. Probing his way down what felt like a hollow wooden stoop, his boots at last met stone. If his daytime survey of the premises had proven fruitful, and the ownership hadn't taken up midnight furniture rearrangement as a hobby, there should be a hearth 12 paces or so from the door. A hearth with a set of fine silver casks on its mantelpiece. Shuffling in silence across the chilly stone floor, he crept to the opposite wall, his gloved fingers gliding deftly along the edge of the fireplace. One of them stopped. Xerdes felt the edges of his mouth pull into a smirk. Even through the soft lambskin leather of his gloves it was unmistakable, the cool caress of a silver carafe. He unclasped a small bag from the rear of his belt and drew its mouth agape. A half-dozen casks in total slid quietly into its deceptive depths, and a quick tug at the drawstring pulled it shut at his side. The rear of the bar made a tempting target, but navigating the obstacle course of empty bottles and silverware he had observed earlier made it a forbidding prospect. Moreover, Xerdes nourished the niggling suspicion, given both the richness of the decor and the proprietor's pronounced high-crest accent, that the man likely kept his oldest vintage on the upper floor near his bed quarters. Xerdes had found men of material wealth often labored under the belief that merely lying unconscious with their valuables caused it to appreciate in value. Noting their proclivities had become a preoccupation since Xerdes had set up shop in the posh Cloventine district, and while he hadn't done nearly as much mapping of its wards and byways as he perhaps should, it seemed the compulsions of the rich were not unique to his native Gilvain quarter, where the residents abided in filth and squalor. At this point the only real difference he'd noted was a more pleasant aroma upon stepping outside. The thief ceased all movement. He could hear the faint footfalls sounding in the other direction now. As the torchlight's gleam sent beams of orange light probing the blackness inside, he heard heavy fingers fumbling with a key ring. Xerdes had company. He hurriedly scaled the wooden planks of a staircase nestled in the east wall, his silhouetted frame sweeping up to the second floor like a black vapor, deciding that forsaking the bar on the first floor and all its valuables for the bigger payout above was the wiser move. Expert footing elicited nary a creak from the weathered boards, and he quickly ascended to the adjoining upstairs hallway. A shadowed shape, wreathed in weak silvery moonlight, glided down the hallway, copperware, coins, and other valuables vanishing in its ghostly wake. It paused. At the far edge of the hallway he could just make it out. A muffled sound of male voices, one exceptionally deep, gravelly, very much the dominant force by the sound of it, the other halting, nervous, perhaps younger by a decade or two, and familiar. As he drew his gaze to the corner the sounds emitted from, he could see the faintest torchlight shuddering through a door. A voyeuristic compulsion drew him near until Xerdes found his eye aligned with a crack in the door frame. Seeing nothing but a naked wall and the shadow of a man tied to a chair, with a much larger oak of a gentleman hovering above him threateningly, he could hear the gravelly voice booming from beneath the door. "Instead is the precise variety of serpent I expect this from, and attempt to the best of my ability to anticipate."
"Oh, aye, sir."
A sound like a tree branch striking a cliff face cut him off. Xerdes could hear the man pacing. The slats in the floor groaned with his every footfall, betraying his bulk. "Hiring from the outside was my first mistake," he fumed. "I usually go in-house for a job like this." His voice then fell to a sinister, throaty contralto as he pressed on. "You are going to tell me what you told Rolf Eggleston about my operation." The shadow of the large man gripped his companion by the throat. "And then you are going to tell me how you knew a single rutting thing about my business without me imparting that knowledge to you." Eggleston. The name seared through Xerdes' mind. It couldn't be. The only Eggleston he'd known was long dead. He'd watched him die.
"Take it easy, Si. I did manage to find where Eggleston was laying his head."
With a loud clatter, the large man kicked his seated companion across the room. Still tied helplessly to the chair, he clattered to the floor, and into Xerdes' line of sight. He thought he'd recognize the waifish voice. The drawn, pale features and unkempt tufts of red hair all confirmed his suspicions. It was Myron Lark, an independent, more commonly operating from his very own corner of his old district, hardly a rival to Xerdes, whose past and skill had kept him in reasonably high demand since the fall of the guilds, but accomplished enough at his handicraft. Lark was a small-time housebreaker, and had no doubt misrepresented his abilities to his pugnacious employer in hopes of elevating his station in the suddenly lucrative Menuvian underworld. Power vacuums had a way of doing that. If Eggleston rang an eerie tone, the name Psy was a dead note. Either way, he was a heavy hitter, a big shot you could spot from 5 rooftops over. There would be no reason for Xerdes to know him at all. Higher society crime comes with higher stakes, Xerdes reasoned, and if you didn't soar with eagles, you never plummet to the earth. "Yes, thank you, you parasite. Thank you for following the breadcrumbs my competent agents laid out for you, and subsequently locating the owner of operations I could have found myself on an evening stroll. Your powers of perception are truly a marvel. Now..." Suddenly the big man lumbered into frame, a stocky, middle-aged giant with rough-hewn features, head completely shaven to hide his baldness and failing, and a broad dark mustache like a push-broom below a pointed nose. His dark eyes seared like anthracite. Xerdes heard a tearing sound as a meaty paw reached down and lifted Myron by his unfastened shirt collar. "Asking twice makes me disagreeable."
"You just told him where I was hired. He knows this is your joint."
The lie seemed sound before he said it. Welliver wasn't biting. "I had a shadow this morning. Seemed to know my routine, which paranoid type that I am, I know you ain't privy to."
I followed you for a week from here. Figured it might be valuable if...
The big man wrapped his fingers around Myron's frail throat.
"Look, you've got a reputation. I needed a plan for a double-cross is all."
Myron Lark was being far too talkative, Xerdes thought to himself. He knew this tune and how it ended for the songbird. Myron had very nearly outlived his usefulness to Psy or whoever he was. Xerdes began to ponder the possibility of intervening. His relationship with the fence was purely professional, but he'd done nothing to deserve a death in a dark tavern. I've never known Eggleston to leave an informant alive that didn't give him enough in return to warrant the gesture.
But please don't kill me, Mr. Welliver.
Xerdes froze. Cyrus Welliver. You didn't have to soar with pigeons, let alone eagles, to spot his influence from the sky. You could spot it on a cloudy day, in an eclipse, while blindfolded. Xerdes knew Cyrus all right. Xerdes planned to live to a ripe retiring age by limiting their interactions entirely. That plan wasn't going well at the moment. Mired in thought and possibility, Xerdes nearly missed the gurgling noises from beyond the door in front of him. Welliver was strangling Myron Lark to death in front of his eyes. As Myron struggled to breathe, Xerdes felt his fingers wrap tightly around the hilt of his dagger, a curved blade of Nazgan make, banded in blued steel. Myron's eyes darted frantically about the room. The fuming Goliath seemed to finally take notice of the crack in the door and the cloaked figure in the dark hallway beyond. The gurgles grew louder as his eyes seemed transfixed on Xerdes. In a flash, the thief drew his dagger. Myron, he thought to himself, I expect a sizable discount for... Just then, the sound of a wooden chair clattering to the stone floor below rang through the entire tavern. Welliver stopped dead, his fingers slipping from Lark's throat. Coughing and sputtering, Myron desperately attempted to regain his wind. I'll hand it to Eggleston. The man wastes no time on prelude. Welliver chortled bemusedly. As he reached for a knife sheathed in the back of his breeches, Myron began to sputter.
Check the door!
Welliver's eyes narrowed as he wheeled to approach the hallway door.
Intruder!
Myron choked out on the floor behind him.
Watching the bloody thing.
Cyrus Welliver's eyes narrowed in dawning realization. He threw wide the door. Nothing. An empty, moonlit hallway. Welliver began to turn when he felt the icy chill of steel pressed to his leathery neck. Evening, came the smoky rumble of Xerdes' voice. Wish I had 5 like you. Welliver's eyebrow cocked itself as he raised his chin to make a more tempting target of his throat. If Eggleston's stock improved this much, I trust you not to bungle the job. I'd rather not bleed out for a fortnight. Untie him. Cy's eyes blinked open. What? Cut his bonds and leave, whispered Xerdes, and with that kicked the crime lord between his broad shoulders, sending him stumbling in Myron's direction. Welliver's knife came clattering to the floor beside him. By the time Cyrus had parted his face from the floorboards and turned back around, he found Myron Lark to be the only person in the room. "A Don's balls," he muttered, and brandishing his knife, cut Myron free from the chair. Ceres had reached the top of the stairs when she heard it, a clattering of bottles in the direction of the bar itself. She spun in place to face the sound, her strong features twisted in Horand fury. "Dunwin!" she whisper-screamed. Was the festering inebriate not content with merely stumbling into a door and fouling their element of surprise? She gripped the angular handle of a Horand broadsword tightly between her hands, hardly the instrument of an assassin, but a weapon that had served her far too well to part with. Hearing nothing in reply, she turned toward the dark corner where the sound had originated. The door closed behind them. The room had now become an inkwell. "Dunwin?" she whispered more quietly, and crept down the stairs and toward the bar. Suddenly, she hit the wall. She thought she had been struck. From where? Her right side, surely her side. Another blow came, missing her head by inches. Flinging free her blade, she soon felt a stiff strike to her left elbow, accompanied by a hollow pop. The sword darted from her grasp and plunged into a nearby chair. Her left arm folded at her side, mangled and useless. The shadow was all around her, striking with ruthless precision. An easy job. This was supposed to be an easy job. Her dagger was on the right side where her shattered arm could not reach. She had one final weapon, a weapon that was to be reserved for disposing of the corpses once Welliver had been slain. She drew the torch from beneath her cloak. The flint slid from her pouch with ease and nestled between her fingers. She made a snapping motion. Her weapon was light. Xerdes stood revealed, stern-faced, dagger sheathed. She could see his chiseled features shadowed by a day or two's growth of beard, a few sienna strands hanging before a pair of firm, confident eyes. His lips crept into a sardonic smirk. Dunwin's unconscious body lay crumpled in a heap in a far corner of the room. She rightly surmised that her watchman, Athros, had met the same fate outside. As she held the torch aloft, Xerdes watched the smirk subside in dismay. He had clearly not known he was striking a woman, until now. If her alabaster complexion, square features, and statuesque frame hadn't marked her as a Horan, the splash of cobalt war paint that cut laterally across a pair of pallid, azure eyes would have. Horans were hardy, barbarian mountain folk, and even their females were not at all distant from his physical equal. But the prospect of maiming a woman was not one he relished, irrespective of stature. If he allowed her to live, she would give his description to this mysterious Rolf Eggleston. His mind rifled through every permutation of his next move in dizzying seconds. Xerdes' frantic expression suddenly vanished. With a shrug, she cast the torch over her shoulder, where it clattered at the top of the stairs. The boards were dry as sun-bleached driftwood, and erupted in flame almost instantly. She dropped to her knees and threw back the hood of her cloak. Pale blonde tresses spilled from beneath her hood, now matted with sweat. Her eyes were shut, as she muttered words in a harsh, foreign brogue. Kinfjond Mjorik. The one arm she could use slowly stretched toward him in sacrificial abandon. Her eyelids parted halfway, and by the flicker of the firelight that was swiftly surrounding them both, he could make out a catatonic gaze and a pair of eyes like blue steel. "You Horans and your theater." Xerdes chuckled wryly. He struck her violently in the face with the hilt of his dagger. Xerdes folded sideways on the tavern's stonework. Through the crackling around him he heard the roof timber beginning to groan. "Well, we've certainly had the drama," Xerdes opined in silence. "Time to exit stage right." With his bag of ill-gotten haul already cooling in an adjacent storm drain outside, Xerdes had only to exit via the front door. The flash of silvery steel dazzled the periphery of his vision, however. The woman's sword still lay embedded in the seat of a chair, feet from her senseless body. His greed briefly overcoming his survival instinct, Xerdes clasped the hilt and drew it free. Given a thieves' split-second appraisal, it was a work of exceptional craftsmanship. No common soldier's blade. The weapons of Gornoth were better renowned for their utility than their aesthetics, yet the blade's hilt bore knotwork and taglios, and the base of the blade itself was dotted with Agrigor runes. Cumbersome, perhaps, particularly to a man of his slight build, but an item of tremendous value regardless. He sheathed the blade in his belt and prepared to exit, yet found that he still stood in place, his eyes transfixed on the unconscious Horand woman. A wooden plank toppled in flame at the stairs behind him with a thunderous crash, yet his gaze remained unshaken. "A thief with a conscience," he muttered to himself. "Oh, I'll go far." Xerdes crouched on a nearby terrace, watching as fiery tendrils roared from the tavern's windows, belching fetid plumes of smoke into the frigid Menuvian night. In cold conscription, it was not so unsuccessful a fracas for the young thief. He came away with a bulging bag of valuable loot, considerably more insight into the city's dangerous patrician underworld, and even enjoyed a fleeting moment with one of the most powerful figures in all of Vale, criminal or otherwise. Better still, his one-time fence had apparently lived to commit further life-threatening error. A resounding victory, generally speaking. As the cloaked frame of Xerdes vaulted to the adjacent rooftop and prepared to make the long journey back to his quarters in the Gilvain, he stepped to the edge and briefly hesitated. "Resounding victory indeed," he intimated internally. "Save one lone indulgence." Xerdes vaulted from the roof and vanished into the dawn. Xerdes awoke to a skull that seemed committed to the principle of escaping her scalp. Yet even immobilized by waves of violent pain, her first thought was of her compatriots. Crashing through a wall of agony, she managed to briefly rise and take stock of her surroundings. She lay in a slick alleyway of cobbled stone, catty-corner from the tavern she had evidently found her way from. A tavern now more accurately described as smoldering rubble. To her bewilderment, her hazed vision could just make out her fellow assassins, Athros and Dunwyn, folded neatly against the very wall she was now propped against, still giddily unconscious. "Trognan's cock!" she abruptly gasped, for her sheath lay empty at her side. Her sword taken, the fogged moors of her memory beginning to clear.
"Stop shouting, will you?"
she heard Dunwyn mumble as he slowly began to stir from unconsciousness. "Well, if it isn't the muddled mercenary," she exclaimed venomously. "Good of you to rejoin the conscious."
"Take it easy, will you?"
he slurred.
"Between being knocked out and the hangover, it feels like a hyperactive blacksmith is pounding ore in my head."
One sunrise and one assault later, and still somehow shit-faced. What fortune for Rolf to have paired us. Obviously Welliver hired for outside protection. Scrawny bastard made off with my Gjörgen Hall.
"Nonsense,"
Dunwyn bellowed.
"I'm certain your cow will turn up."
"My sword, crotshit. Where I come from, our weapons have a name and a soul. We pass them from generation to generation. Steal a clan-sworn weapon warrants execution. I still had use of my sword. She stopped dead. Her shattered arm, it had been set and wrapped in bandages. Cyrus Welliver hacked and wheezed his way down a steamy, cobbled alleyway. He had run for nearly 2 blocks, Myron Lark stumbling through the seedy Menuvian side streets just a few paces ahead. Without warning, both men collapsed, nearly in unison, having ducked into a small garden of an oblivious nobleman. Myron at last broke the succession of labored gasps with an expression of the obvious. They aren't following us." Welliver, lying on his back in a bed of foliage, replied only with an exasperated glance. "I should—" Sai's meaty paw smacked against Myron's neck before he could utter another word.
"That man,"
he hoarsely wheezed.
"The intruder?"
"The very same."
Just looked like an independent to me. Probably not one of Egginson's.
"Assuredly not,"
Sai agreed, his breath beginning to slow.
"Which is why you have one last thing to give me, before I give your sad story an end."
Myron Lark choked back sobs as the mammoth Sai Welliver hovered above him.
"His name